Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. As you can tell from the title up there, I'm continuing my trek through the episodes of Batman the Animated Series. A classic show from my childhood in the 90s and probably a good amount of your childhoods. This, of course, is episode 14 from a teleplay by Paul Dini, and the one, like I said at the end of the previous episode, that won a Daytime Emmy Award for Outstanding Writing in an Animated Program. This, of course, is the episode that reinvented Mr. Freeze, so hard in fact that it became his de facto backstory in the comics for ages. This, of course, is Heart of Ice. And, of course, we have Michael, I'm sorry if I mispronounce his last name and butcher it, and Sarah voicing Mr. Freeze, and, of course, we got Mark Hamill voicing his nemesis, Ferris Boyle. You gotta love some of these puns right there. Freeze and Boyle. You know they knew what they were doing with that name, even though it's spelled like the name Boyle, but still, come on. You know they could not resist a good heat pun there. Now, before this episode came out, Mr. Freeze was one of those villains that was really, really gimmicky and really leaned into the gimmick. Freeze-based, in a suit, uses ice guns and all that. Not really much to speak of, and to the point where I actually forgot he was in the 60s show. Granted, I don't remember if I watched the entire show, but it wasn't until years after I stopped watching the 60s show and this show that when I was just doing random Batman research, I found out he was in the show, and I'm like, I don't remember. And of course, at one point, he was even known as Mr. Zero. That might be part of it. I don't remember if he was called that in that show or not, but Mr. Zero, Mr. Freeze. Kinda see it. Now with this one, they added a little depth to it because they added the fact that he became a villain because of his wife. Because his wife had a then uncurable illness. I don't know if in the comics when they adapted this, if they gave it a name. Here they don't. And of course in when they later adapted this storyline for Batman and Robin, they called it McGregor syndrome and then added to it by giving Alfred the same disease. But in order to try and cure it, Mr. Freeze is trying to put his wife into cryogenic stasis, and something goes wrong. Here is Ferris Boyle interrupts it. There's some shoving, and Freeze gets doused with chemicals, and it makes it to where his body cannot survive outside of a very cold environment. Hence, he has to be in the cryosuit. Now, there's a lot of twists and turns depending on which continuity we're looking at. With this one, his original idea is to get revenge on Boyle. And of course, Batman, by the end of this episode, interrupts that. Now, I gotta acknowledge the refrigerator in the room. Let me get that. And that was, the original intent was that Nora, his wife, was to be dead. The first couple Freeze episodes were made with that in mind. It wasn't until later episodes, and specifically the Subzero film, which I still have not watched, so once we get to that part of the timeline, I'll be going into that film mostly blind when it comes to how the film is. I know some plot points, but that'll be interesting to watch. It wasn't until the creator of that film took and made the film that she was retconned to be alive. But for all intents and purposes, she was supposed to be dead. And if you watch this episode with that in mind, you can see it. It's the way that Freeze talks about her. It doesn't strike me as someone who's longing for his wife because she's in cryogenic stasis. The extreme lengths he's going to get Boyle doesn't strike me as revenge for somebody who caused an accident. And if it was only for the fact that he interrupted the experiment and it turned Freeze into the monster he is, the dialogue would be different. So this strikes me more that for all intents and purposes, she's supposed to be dead. And in fact, in later Adventures Continue comics, they kind of reversed that retcon and had her die of a relapse of the illness. Which it's still one of those, but I could see why they would course correct with that. Hey, the original intention, she's supposed to be dead, not just off on something. Which I know there's a whole thing about the lady in the fridge with that. But for all intents and purposes, Nora was supposed to be just a plot device in order to tie into Mr. Freeze's backstory. So I kind of get it. but I think that's more a retrospect thing to where she became her own character later on and not just a plot device. For all intents and purposes, originally, yeah. Although, I will say it would have been interesting to get a flashback with her, but I don't know if in any of these subsequent episodes there would have been enough time. More so after the next time we see Mr. Freeze, because if I remember right, the next one is going to be the one where we see her body, and then that would have been the confirmation, like, oh yeah, she's gone. Now, I brought it up a couple times, but Faulkner said the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. And this whole thing with Freeze and Nora and that whole inner conflict definitely fits that. Although in this case, it is Freeze wanting to get revenge on Boyle for what he did. Now, Mr. Freeze in the episode, he's stealing stuff. You can tell he's really trying to fire an icy shot at Boyle. Batman is trying to intervene. And he's trying to figure out who this guy is, because this is the first time Freeze has shown up. He's like, who is this guy? And of course, he goes undercover as, as a security guard at one point, and he goes undercover as himself, talking with Ferris Boyle, trying to figure out stuff, because he hears about the break-ins, and he gets a little bit of info, and that sparks a memory about the explosion the previous year. But it's when he goes undercover and as a security guard at Boyle's place, is when he actually gets his hands on footage which reveals Freeze's backstory. It shows what happened. The Boyle was responsible for everything, the explosion, the fight. And you really feel sorry for Freeze. You don't agree with his methods. I'm not going to say that. You don't agree with how far he's going with all this. But you understand it, especially with how much of a scumbag they make Boyle. Other than Bruce, just about every rich person that they show in this show is a scumbag to various degrees. And Boyle, I'd say he's probably one of the worst ones, where he masquerades as a philanthropist. He masquerades as a man of the people, kind of like how Bruce is. But behind closed doors, he is a scumbag of the highest order. He's the type of rich person that there is a reason the phrase "eat the rich" exists. So by the end, when he gets his comeuppance and he gets outed, especially since he was getting a humanitarian war, and I'm like, yeah, good. And the dialogue he tells to Mr. Freeze during the experiment where he's pulling it, where he's like, almost $7 million in the hole. I'm like, oh, poor baby. Are you a few million in the hole and you got billions? Let me play a sad song for you on the world's smallest violin. And it's also the fact that, for me, science should be partially for the betterment of humankind. That really makes me roll my eyes with all that. But it adds to Boyle being a scumbag villain. And that's the thing. We get two villains for the price of one. We get the more obvious villain and we get the more background one. Not a surprise villain, because we know from the beginning he's going to be a bad guy. We're just wondering how at the end Batman's going to handle both of them. Now Boyle, of course, he handles by outing him with all that by the end. But Mr. Freeze, he talks with him, and you could tell that Freeze does not want Batman in his way, but it's nothing personal between them. Where you kind of get the feeling that Freeze, part of him, respects Batman and what he does, because he's someone that is doing what he is doing to try to better people's lives. And you could probably guess that he might see Batman as a kindred spirit, because he probably assumed, like, well, something happened to him. Why else would he dress up like a bat and jump from buildings and all that? But it's all subtextual. And maybe I'm reading too much into that, but it's just the way it comes off to me a little bit, just from how the dialogue's constructed and how everything goes about. Now, Batman does stop Freeze, obviously. The way it happens in the course of one episode, it's one of those Chekhov's gun situations. Because at one point, because of being exposed to the freeze ray, Batman catches a cold. And when he's going out on patrol, Alfred hands him a little canister or thermos, and he's like, what is this? The only way to fight a cold is chicken soup. And of course, he uses it to smash open Freeze's headpiece. And when that happened, I'm like, huh, clever. It is an age-appropriate one for kids, but it also works. And plus, there's also a little way you can look at it as propaganda that, oh yeah, letting the kids know if they're sick, make sure you eat your chicken noodle soup. Yeah, when I'm always feeling under the weather, soup is one of the few things I can keep down. Whether it be chicken noodle, egg drop, menudo, pozole, always hits the spot. It's also because the broth helps you stay hydrated. Especially when you got one of those colds to where water tastes metallic. Now, I mentioned the whole thing about there's a lot of scenes that kind of show that Nora's supposed to be dead. I think there's bits of dialogue that Freeze says throughout the episode that really go with that. One of them is his little, I don't want to call it a rant, but it's little soliloquy towards Batman when he has him at his clutches, and he's all like, "Oh, what a warm hand to hold. Yes, I'd kill for that." But what really cinches it is the end scene where Freeze is behind bars in his temperature-controlled room, and he has a little thing of Nora dancing, and he's speaking to it. That one is the one that cinches it. And like a lot of the endings of these episodes, we see Batman watching. Now, I notice that they mainly do this when it's someone who Batman feels can be rehabilitated. And even though he tried to kill the man, Freeze, you can definitely tell, is one of the few that can be rehabilitated 100%. And this continues into other ones. The comics, I think I've done it a couple times. And of course, even the Arkhamverse did that. To where they are at odds, but it's mainly like a slight difference in what they want to do. That's the main reason he's a boss in the second game. And then after that, you guys become allies and all that. And then, even though it's bittersweet, his ending in Arkham Knight, Batman's there for him and Nora. He helps him to defend Nora for a reason. And of course, the rest of his arc in this verse. I'm going to keep quiet on my thoughts on certain parts of it until we get to the corresponding episodes and, of course, the Subzero movie. But you kind of already might be able to guess my thoughts on a little bit of it. But with that, I'll say probably resurrecting Nora was a mistake, but we'll see if I hold through with that thought by the time we get to Subzero and the stuff afterwards. Now, there is some trivia here that are there. Like I said, it won the Emmy, which I have to admit 100% agreed. And this is why I will have to say that this is probably my favorite of the episodes so far. That, Two-Face, probably running up, Never Too Late is a good one. Of course, the pilot. Here's some things. Anthony Hopkins was one of Bruce Timm's first choices for Mr. Freeze. And I can imagine that. There's something about his voice that would have been interesting for this character. It's the way he delivers lines. I don't know if he would have done it the same way he does his delivery for Hannibal Lecter, but like a similar one, I can imagine. And of course, we know he can play the grieving widower going out for revenge. I mean, that's kind of part of his character in The Mask of Zorro. Different characterizations, but that similar thing. And of course, it happens right in front of them. I can imagine that. Boyle, you would never get rid of me. Now, of course, eventually Ansara was cast, but Tim noted he had difficulty getting him to play the character flat. Notice I say flat, not wooden. There's a difference. Wooden is you have no emotion whatsoever. Nothing in your enunciation. Yes, asleep. But flat is, there is a type of emotion there, but it's very, very, very restrained. And for a character like Mr. Freeze, that's what you're going for. And this is what Tim had to say about it. He was acting too much. It was really frustrating for him. I mean, he'd never done cartoons before, and an actor's first natural instinct is to act. A little cut in there, especially when it's only voice acting and that's all you have to work with. No body language, no eye movement. He kept giving these line readings with all this inflection in him. I kept telling him that it had to be less, a lot less, like a robot. He kept saying it sounded so flat. Everybody else was looking at me too and was asking me if I was sure. To them it sounded flat. I think it really sells it. I wanted his voice to sound like the Ebonites in that old Outer Limit episode Nightmare. They sound real metallic and hollow. I even played that for him at the recording sessions and explained that this is what I wanted it to sound like. It drove the sound guy crazy doing it. But of course the end result speaks for itself. It's what works with the character. Because he's supposed to be cold and emotionless. And of course that's probably why other iterations and other ones probably don't work as well. But hey, some of them still do work. Now Bruce also came up with the idea that Freeze barely escaped the cryogenic experiment and considers himself dead. And hence he has no fear of death and has no emotions. And that's part of the reason for that, which makes sense. And of course that whole goes with the whole thing of Nora actually being dead. But is, that thing, I've probably kicked that dead horse enough times. There's really not much else to say about this other than the score is pretty decent. The animation, excellent, really sells home the story. The episode's paced pretty well. I mean, the only parts of it that are slow, really, or when Batman's unraveling the mystery of what happened to Freeze. And then, of course, a little bit of the lead up to the climactic battle. Freeze storms Boyle's party, and Boyle realizes who he is. But it's paced appropriately. And really, that's all there is to say about that. The next one's going to be a two-parter, and they'll each be reviewed independently. And of course, one of them is going to be the first episode of the show that was actually aired on TV, which of course has to do with the same reason that there were design choices made for the previous episode, and that is film synergy, of course. Next, we're going to get into the Cat and the Claw. Till then, everybody.